Welcome back, guys. Today, unfortunately, we have to talk about something that I think is a little bit more sobering, even than the Great Depression. Not that the Great Depression is exactly an exciting thing or something that we should be happy about, but today we are going to talk about the rise of Adolf Hitler and at least a little bit about the rise of the Nazi ideology that he invented or that he represented. I don't want to treat Hitler with a positive viewpoint at all. And the rise of Hitler, we need to be careful because Hitler is going to succeed at many of the things he does. And he is going to prove to be an incredibly able politician. And I don't want that to in any way seem like, Hitler is somebody that we should look up to. Certainly not. But he is very successful. And he is very good at doing what he does. And we cannot say that Hitler did not have a certain appeal and charisma that attracted people to following him and to doing what he wanted people to do and doing the things that he said. And I just want to put that out there as a disclaimer. Do not in any way take this as an endorsement of Hitler, despite the fact that we're going to be talking about the quote unquote positives of Hitler's rise to power. He's going to be successful. He's going to do some pretty amazing things from a German history perspective. We need to understand this for two reasons. Of course, this is an American history course. So you might be asking, why do we need to go in depth into Hitler? He's the guy we beat. How much more do we need to know? But remember that the question that I think every person in Britain and France and the Soviet Union or Russia today and the United States needs to ask is how in the world did Hitler actually get to where he was? How is it possible that Hitler and his cronies killed 6 million Jews? And that doesn't even begin to account for the gypsies and the homosexuals and all of the other groups of people that he slaughtered in death camps. How did Hitler start a war that killed possibly as many 71 million people? How did people not see this coming? How did Hitler slip through the cracks and gain the power that he did? These are questions that I think we need to ask. And they're questions that, in my opinion, are some of the most important for you personally as you becoming a voting adult. Just remember that there were people in Germany all the way through 1945 that didn't realize that Hitler was who he was. Right? We think of Hitler, and I don't think there's really only one other person that I think of that we could put at his same level of evil, and that is Joseph Stalin, the dictator of the Soviet Union during the same time period. Wow, cannot speak. The only other person in my mind that is of equal level is to them is maybe Mao Zedong, the dictator of communist China in the 1950s and 1960s. How did someone so evil, who represents evil in our minds, get to be the leader of millions of Germans? And how did millions of Germans not see through his deception and his lies, or did they? And did they willingly follow after Hitler? And by the way, this topic is quite complex, and there are really some interesting things that we could talk about. We just don't have time to. So that's why I want to talk about it for American history. We need to understand, how did Hitler do this so that we can avoid the next Hitler, the next politician that seems to be offering everything we want, but is in fact bringing something that is wholly evil and unfortunate. Now, first off, before we get into Hitler's life, let's talk about the unfortunate end of World War I. Remember that World War I ends with an armistice, a ceasefire in November 11th of 1918. Unfortunately, the peace treaty brought up after that armistice that ended the war for Germany, France, and the UK is called the Treaty of Versailles. And as we have talked about in several lectures and in class discussions, the Treaty of Versailles is a particularly poor peace treaty. And in many ways, the Treaty of Versailles was so badly written that it almost guaranteed a second European conflict. It did not guarantee Hitler's rise to power. Certainly, Hitler was not necessarily required out of the Treaty of Versailles, but it is really hard to comprehend how Europe could have avoided a second full-scale war with the wording of the Treaty of Versailles. Again, particularly poor. And by the way, of all the people that hated the treaty, the Germans hated it the most because it made them evil. It made them the bad guys. It saddled them with a completely ridiculous and unpayable expense for the war. And really, it just caused a lot of problems. And that issue, that problem with the Treaty of Versailles, would be what eventually brought Hitler to his position of power. And we'll talk about that. So let's talk about Hitler. Hitler, this surprises many people, was not actually German, not in the way that we think of the term, okay? He wasn't from Germany. He was, in fact, from Austria. Now, when we think about it, and again, I apologize to any Austrians watching this, you might be really insulted by this. In reality, Austrians and Germans are effectively the same people. They both speak German. They both have very similar roots from a ethnic and cultural point of view. But Hitler was technically born in Austria. He was actually born in a little village just on the border between the area of Germany called Bavaria, or the area where the city of Munich is from, if you're familiar with that city, southern Germany, if you're not. But he's actually born in Austria, and he grows up in Austria. Eventually, he moves to the capital of Austria, which is Vienna, and that's where he's going to live his formative years, his years where he is developing his ideas as a young man. This is fairly common knowledge, but you might not be aware of this. But originally, Adolf Hitler actually went to Vienna because he wanted to get involved in the arts. Specifically, Hitler wanted to become a painter. And actually, Hitler's landscape artwork is not all that terrible. In fact, you can look up Hitler's landscape art and you can see what it looks like. He was not necessarily a terrible painter. Where he struggled was portraits, which that I'm sure says something deep and psychological about Hitler himself, but we don't have time to get into that. The unfortunate end of that story is that the art instructors at the University of Vienna reject Hitler. He simply does not have the artistic skill that they are looking for. And one of the big what ifs of history is, had they accepted Hitler as an art student, would World War II have looked anything like it did? The answer to that is probably no, because Hitler probably would not have turned into the raging psychopath that he was. But again, hindsight's 2020. I don't think we can blame the art instructors for what they did, but we certainly can blame Hitler for what he did after that. Hitler really did not have a good situation after that. He spent money that his parents sent him, specifically his mother, to live, and he spent it rather frivolously. Eventually, he kind of got thrown in a poorhouse where he had to work, and in the evenings, he would go buy a couple books, and he would study, and he really didn't know what to do with his life. And it's at this point, at least according to Hitler's own memoirs, that he began to see the problem with international Jewry, okay? And that is, by the way, Hitler's exact term. Please do not take this as an anti-Semitic remark towards the Jews. But Hitler begins to see the Jews everywhere, real and imagined. And the reason that he was rejected from the art academy there in Vienna, in his mind, was because the Jews controlled the art academy. And in Hitler's mind, the Jews were actually in control of the entire world. Not only were the Jews the richest, dirtiest capitalists, the people that were corrupt and stealing things, but they were also the communists. They were the ones overthrowing European governments. They were keeping everybody at each other's throats and profiting off of the cash. And Hitler begins to hate the Jews extensively during this period. Again, if we can believe Hitler's own memoirs, which he wrote in prison in the late 1920s. We don't have anything from Hitler during this actual period because he's not a diary writer. Okay, Hitler did not write his thoughts on an everyday basis, and so we'll just have to take Hitler's words that he began hating the Jews in Austria. By the way, it should also be pointed out that Europeans in general did not have a very positive view of the Jews. Hitler was not a single crazy person out there disliking the Jews, and that was very unusual for people around him. No, in fact, the reality was that most Europeans disliked the Jews. Most Europeans blamed Jews for various problems, most of which were not caused by the Jews. And this is very complex, and there's a long-standing history for why this is, and we really, unfortunately, just don't have time to get into it today. But Hitler's ideas were not unique, which might tell you why he gained some traction later on in his life. It's not like he was the only person that hated Jewish people out there. There were many. Now, World War I breaks out in 1914, and actually there's this really interesting photo that I would love to show you right now that shows actually Hitler on the day that the war is announced. You can see him kind of ecstatic and joy. He's very happy that this war has broken out. He saw this as an opportunity for Germany. Remember, while he is Austrian, he really views himself more as a German. For Germany to show that it is really the most powerful nation in Europe, it's the most dominant nation in Europe. And Hitler actually goes across the border into Germany and attempts to join the German army. And he's very nearly rejected, but eventually some of his friends get him an army commission, and he's able to join the German army rather than the Austrian army. despite the fact that he is, in fact, Austrian. And eventually that leads to him being able to get German citizenship a little bit later on in his life. Now, Hitler served at first in the front lines. He served in the trenches. Eventually, he was promoted to corporal, where he would actually serve as a trench runner. Remember this, while telephone and telegram were available in many areas, the conditions were simply too bad for this to work, because in order to communicate in either telegraph or telephone, you needed wire, and those wires could be hit by artillery shells. They could be cut by various things. And so if you needed a message delivered, you might hand it to a guy, and he would physically run that message from one location to another. And this often exposed him to incredibly dangerous situations. I'm not sure if any of you have seen the new movie 1917. Just think about that long distance shot where the young man is running across the battlefield, right? Everybody's kind of running in the other direction. He's running sideways. You might think to yourself, that's a pretty safe position to be running compared to everybody else. But again, artillery shells are hitting all over the place. It was a dangerous position. And to Hitler's credit, he was actually awarded for bravery. So clearly the man did not lack personal bravery. He ran messages between various points in the German lines. Eventually, Hitler's actually wounded in that role. He's actually hit by a gas attack from the French, and he breathes in a mouthful of poison gas, and this badly burns his lungs. He's carried off the battlefield and spends several months recuperating in a German field hospital. Eventually, by the time that Hitler is recovered, the war has ended, and this is something that bothered him deeply later in life. He said, "I was thwarted of my opportunity to take part in the defense of my homeland." Basically, when Hitler left the war, Germany was doing okay, and when he recovered enough to go back to battle, the war was over, and he was very frustrated by this. Now, Hitler did make a full recovery, although many people believe that the very distinct sound that Hitler had later on in his life was actually a result of that gas attack. The lung damage that he'd taken created this very unique speaking voice that Hitler had. And while you can go and listen to Hitler again on YouTube, there are recordings of him. This probably won't be as impactful as, say, FDR, because he's speaking a different language and he's Hitler. Hopefully you don't find Hitler talking to be all that interesting. But still, he does gain this distinctive quality to his voice, and that is actually something that is valuable to Hitler later in life. He's a very distinctive speaker. People come out to hear Hitler because he's different than everybody else, not just because of what he's talking about, because of how he's talking. He's a very unique speaker. Now, Hitler, after the war, decided to stay in the army, because if he didn't, he would probably get deported to Austria. So he decided to stay in the army if they would have him, and they would. And so he began to serve as kind of an official spy. And the reason I say official spy is because he walked around in his uniform by requirement. And basically what the government would do is they would send these soldiers to watch political parties in Germany. Germany had been transformed by a new constitution written in the city of Weimar. We oftentimes call this the Weimar Republic of Germany. And the government wanted to keep tabs on radical groups. And so Hitler was sent to watch several radical groups, the most important of which was the DAP, which translated into English would be the German Workers' Party. Hitler observed several meetings of the DAP, and the reason that he did that was because the DAP had registered in its official party, and in the army's capacity as a informant, it had to watch everyone who had a political gathering. And so Hitler was sent to observe these guys. This was very bad for the entire world, because Hitler apparently liked what he saw in the DAP. He eventually left the army, and Hitler joined the DAP as one of its founding members, and joined it the following year. He became one of the most prominent speakers, and eventually he would go on to kind of take over the party. Its leader would be pushed to the side by Hitler, and Hitler would transform it into the Nazi party that we are familiar with today. The first thing that Hitler did after he kind of came to influence in the party is he decided to change the name. One of the problems with the People's Workers' Party is it really had a strong communist vibe. In fact, when we talk about the Soviet Union, we'll talk about things like the workers' communes and the workers' parties and the workers this and the workers that. There was this really strong connection with the word worker with communism. And so the first thing that Hitler wanted to do is he wanted to make it a little bit clear what his group was. And I say that with kind of my tongue in my cheek, because what he names it is the National Socialist German Workers' party. And people have often said that this is a really big contradiction, kind of like a contradiction on the level of the Holy Roman Empire, which wasn't holy, wasn't Roman, and wasn't an empire. The National Socialist German Workers' Party was run by an Austrian. It was incredibly small, so I don't think we could call it national. Socialist may be accurate, workers definitely not, and I guess it was a party. So most of it's contradictions, right? He named it the National Socialist German Workers' Party, which again, this is different from the communists. It doesn't sound like a communist party anymore. So we'll at least give Hitler that. He changed the name of the party, so it doesn't sound like a communist party anymore. But certainly exactly what it is unclear. By the way, that's actually by design. Okay, Hitler does not want people knowing exactly what he thinks. I mean, if he'd wanted to be clear about what he thinks, he could have called it like the anti-Jewish party. Okay, I mean, that was the core belief that Hitler had. The anti-Jewish remilitarized Germany party, I mean, doesn't really roll off the tongue very well, and perhaps would draw some attention that you don't want. So the National Socialist German Party, it's like, what is that? I don't even know what they are. No, maybe I can vote for them, right? That's kind of the idea that Hitler was going for. Now, Hitler began to really transform not only the party, but the culture of the party. Hitler went from being the leader of the party to being the leader. And maybe you're familiar with the German title for leader, Führer, which Hitler began to be called as he became more and more popular in his party. He also began to create different organizations connected to his party that the real focus of them were to idolize him. And the two most famous of these, and the ones that we're going to talk about today, are the SA and the Hitler Youth. The SA were effectively a group of personal bodyguards to Hitler. You can think of them almost as a private military unit. They would wear the armbands, they would have uniforms on, brown uniforms actually. They were sometimes called the brown shirts because of the color of the uniform that they would wear. And what they would do is they would not only escort Hitler to his speaking arrangements, but their job was literally to physically defend Hitler if there were violent people there. If the communists came in to try and break up their meeting because Hitler was violently anti-communist, their job was to literally have a fist fight with the communists in the middle of the area. And this gave them a great sense of camaraderie. They felt like, wow, we're actually defending Germany. And Hitler kind of whipped them into a frenzy, and they kind of worshipped and adored Hitler, and they were his personal troops. He could get them to do basically whatever he wanted. And eventually they would grow into a much larger organization once Hitler came to power. He's not in power yet. He's just a political party leader. But eventually when he becomes Chancellor of Germany, the SA and their military division, the SS, is going to be his personal enforcers. And the SS is responsible for many of the killing of the Jews in the Holocaust fields of Poland, which is a story, unfortunately, we do have to talk about another time. The other group is the Hitler Youth. This is effectively evil Boy Scouts, at least in my own mind. It was an organization where effectively you would take all of the young people, both men and women, or boys and girls, rather, I should say, and effectively they would be trained in a number of useful skills, or at least skills that the Nazis considered useful. And remember that the Nazis ideas were that men should be very manly. They needed to be soldiers, of course, because Hitler's anticipating a war to eliminate the Jews. Women should be very skilled at home and different things like that. And so these programs would teach kids these useful skills. So at the first level, it appears good, right? We all like programs that teach kids to go outside and hike around, learn how to make clothes, learn how to support themselves. These are good programs. The problem is that Hitler is doing this to train future soldiers and future mothers of soldiers. And while he's doing that, he's really propagandizing these kids to worship him. Every day they talk about Hitler and they take oaths to Hitler and they talk about all of the awesome things that Hitler's doing. And pretty soon this is a brainwashing program where these young people of Germany come out thinking that Hitler can do no wrong and he's perfect and he's the best person that has ever lived. So Hitler's redesigning this party. It's not so much a party that does anything but what Hitler does. Okay, that's really what they are. They don't have a one singular idea. It's not like they're conservative, they're not liberal, they're not progressive. They are Hitler. Whatever Hitler says, that's what they do. Okay, so when we talk about the ideas of the Nazis, sometimes it's hard. It's like, oh, what do they believe on this? They seem like they changed their mind. Well, they probably did because only one guy mattered. Hitler. If Hitler changed his mind on a subject, then the party changed its mind. So that's really important to understand about the Nazis and about Hitler and how all of that worked. Now, Hitler actually tried to take over Germany not once, but twice. He failed the first time, and I wish that would have been all we ever heard of the guy. If that had been all there was, you guys and I would probably not be talking about Hitler, even in world history class. But unfortunately, his first failure is going to set up a second success. Now, Hitler decided in 1923 that he was going to take matters into his own hands and attempt to take the area around Munich, Bavaria, and make a separatist nation and kind of strike out on his own. The reason he wanted to do this, by the way, is because Munich was very anti the government in Berlin, or excuse me, Weimar at this time. Again, it's Weimar Republic. And in addition to this, the Great Depression, excuse me, not the Great Depression, the war reparations that Germany was having to pay to France, Britain, and the United States were just devastating the German economy. So the Germans were having a economic depression. Remember, we talked about hyperinflation, where you would be paid in the beginning of the day, you would hand the money to your son or your wife. She would go and buy you lunch, because by the time you got paid at lunch, your money would be basically worthless and you couldn't buy anything if you'd kept it from the morning. And prices went up 3 times a day for workers, and they went up 3 times a day for sellers. And eventually, people were buying loaves of bread with entire wheelbarrows of banknotes, right? We remember that. Well, that's going on in 1923, or at least the beginnings of this process. And the Germans are upset with this. And so Hitler says, perfect, this is the perfect opportunity to strike. He's going to do this by recruiting one of the German war heroes from World War I, a general by the name of Erich Ludendorff, probably the second most important German general that had emerged from the war, the other one being Paul von Hindenburg, who we'll talk about shortly. Ludendorff supported Hitler's ideas as far as he understood them. And by the way, I'm not sure he understood them all that well, because again, Hitler was kind of cagey with that. Remember, National Socialist German Workers' Party, nobody knows what Hitler thinks, but he tells Ludendorff, look, the Treaty of Versailles was dumb. Every German agreed with that. He says, we're going to change things. We're going to stick it to the French. We're not going to abide by the treaty. Ludendorff had thought, why did we even surrender in the first place? And he decides to support Hitler. So Hitler kind of parades Ludendorff as this leader of the party, even though it's actually Hitler that's leading. Ludendorff is kind of the focus of this, what's called a Beer Hall Putsch. Okay, Putsch is a German word. It kind of relates to the French word coup d'etat. If you're not familiar with either of those terms, let me try and explain them. Basically, this is an attempt to take over the government by forceful means. So not by democracy, not by the regular means that the government is transferred. It's trying to take power by using the military to force your rivals out. And so Hitler and his SA try and march into Munich and take over all of the city offices and name themselves as in charge. The problem is this doesn't work. Not only did the news of this plan get out to the German army, but the German army was not having this, and they marched troops in the city and arrested a number of people, including not only Erich Ludendorff, but William Hitler. Again, long quarantine, guys. I apologize. Adolf Hitler. Now, Adolf Hitler goes to trial, and every other leader of this rebellion was acquitted. The Germans really didn't want to throw anybody in jail. Wasn't worth it. Hitler demanded to be thrown in jail. He would not plead not guilty. He pleaded guilty. He demanded a trial. And he demanded to be thrown in jail. So Hitler is sentenced to 5 years in prison. He only ends up serving 9 months. He serves that time in a minimum security prison. Basically, he was given a free room by the German government and people could come see him. In fact, Hitler actually told his guards on multiple occasions, please don't bring anyone to see me. I've seen too many people for the day. So I don't think Hitler was really suffering in this prison cell, to say the least. From prison, Hitler is actually going to become a national hero to many people in Germany, because Hitler had used that opportunity of his trial to tear at the Treaty of Versailles. He condemned the Treaty of Versailles. It was an evil document. It was hurting Germany. If someone like him was in charge, well, he would stick it to the French. He would stick it to the British. He would not follow that treaty. He would not have signed something like that and embarrassed the German people by agreeing to it. Okay, so Hitler really gets a national platform. People are starting to be aware of this guy. They say, hey, I hate the Treaty of Versailles too. This Hitler guy is at least doing something about it. And he begins to build a following. In fact, while Hitler was in prison, he spent the time writing a book called Mein Kampf. Mein Kampf is German for the English Mein Struggle, and it basically lays out Hitler's worldview and the Nazi Party's worldview. Again, because the Nazi Party is, at the end of the day, the party of Hitler. Hitler really focuses on two things. Number one, why the Treaty of Versailles is wrong and bad and evil, and how he's going to tear it up if he ever gets into power. Number two, Hitler explains how the Jews are actually the real problem, and they're at the root of all of Germany's problems. All of the financial problems that Germany was having, it was the Jews. All of the Treaty of Versailles written by Jews. The Soviet Union, which was scaring many people, a very powerful nation with huge resources and many soldiers in the East that could come for Germany, run by Jews, right? Everything and every problem that Hitler could see, the Jews were at the center of it, according to Hitler. Again, not in reality. The Jews actually weren't causing all these problems, but this is how Hitler saw it. He was convinced that the Jews were everywhere and they were causing all of these problems. And after Hitler served his 9 months and he gets out, he is immensely popular in Germany. So it's 1925 and Hitler is now a household name. Okay, everybody knows his name. Think about this, for example, for Bernie Sanders, right? Bernie Sanders until 2016 was a state senator from Vermont. I doubt most people outside of Vermont had ever heard of the guy. And yet now Bernie Sanders is a household name, even losing multiple elections, which, by the way, Hitler's going to do too. By the way, I should say that I am not actually comparing Bernie Sanders to Hitler. That would be unfair even to Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders is not as bad as Hitler by any stretch of the imagination. But still, same principle, right? Even losing elections, even having bad things happen to you, your name gets recognized. And name recognition is huge for politics. Eventually, Hitler again continues to develop the Nazi Party, and between 1928 and 1932, the Nazis went from 2% of the national election vote to almost 40% of the national vote. And by the way, by 1932, the Nazi Party was the largest single party in German politics. Now, this is hard for Americans to understand because we have what's called a two-party system. You're either a Democrat or you're a Republican, and the Senate and the House of Representatives are divided between Democrats and Republicans. There's a few independents, but there's really not too many of them. In German politics, and in fact in many nations' parliament structures, there can be a whole bunch of parties. And by having 40% of the vote, the Nazis effectively controlled the government because no one could pass a bill unless the Nazis agreed to this. And this becomes particularly problematic because the Nazis effectively said in Mein Kampf, Hitler said, I disagree with government. I'm not going to use democracy. So you have a party that specifically says, we don't like democracy as the group you have to use to democratically get something done. So this is very problematic for anyone who wants to get things done. By the way, the second largest political group in the Reichstag, the German parliament, was the communists, who also didn't want to use the government to get anything done. So we just have a mess. By 1932, German politics is an absolute mess. The Nazis were also incredibly skilled at something that is called propaganda. That is the art of basically taking ideas and political slogans and spreading them to huge numbers of people. Hitler would fly and speak in 3 to 5 cities every day. They would take him in airplanes and take him around Germany. No politician had ever done this in the past. Hitler would radio broadcast his speeches. The Nazis would hand out flyers and make posters and post them in squares. They would have these huge rallies. None of this had ever been done before. Hitler is experimenting in new political techniques that, by the way, are still used today. Every presidential candidate in the United States in the last 20 years has used techniques that were literally invented by the Nazis. Now, again, just because it's invented by the Nazis doesn't necessarily make it wrong, but the Nazis are going to really use this. Again, they went from 2% of the vote to 40% of the vote in 4 years. That is incredible growth when it comes to politics. Now, eventually, Hitler is going to work out a complicated series of maneuvers that is going to get him elected as Chancellor of Germany. The way he does this is by effectively forcing a presidential election. And in this presidential election, he runs for president. He actually loses to a former German general by the name of Paul von Hindenburg. But in losing, he effectively sets himself up for the position he actually wanted, which was the position of chancellor. The position of chancellor is the actual working position of the German government. It's kind of like, and not exactly similar, but it's kind of like the British with having a prime minister who actually runs the government and the queen who technically is in control of the government but delineates that power over to the prime minister. Kind of the same thing with the president and the chancellor in Germany. The president's technically in charge, but he gives all of his power to the chancellor, and that's what Hitler becomes. Unfortunately, Hindenburg dies less than a year after Hitler takes power, and this enables Hitler to take that power that the president had and take it to himself. So Hitler names himself not only chancellor, but also president. And finally, the last piece of bringing Hitler to power is there is a fire in the German parliament. And this fire is lit supposedly by a communist. Now, the reality is most people believe that Hitler and the Nazis paid a young man to light the fire and then killed him and left communist propaganda on his body. So it would appear that the communists had lit the fire, but really the Germans had the Nazis had lit the fire, okay? But by the fire happening, what Hitler did with this is he actually took power for himself. He had the parliament pass a series of bills that gave Hitler almost unlimited power to destroy communists and anyone else who subverted the state. And of course, who would Hitler think subverted the state? That would, of course, be the Jews. And in 1933, Hitler is not only chancellor, but he's president, and he gets parliament to effectively give him unlimited power. And one of the first things that Hitler does is he eliminates national elections, and he suspends the power of the parliament to do anything that he doesn't specifically tell them to do. So in the course of less than a year, Hitler went from being a minority party leader to being the sole ruler of Germany. And there was no way for the German people to get rid of him. I have to wrap up now. I'm already a little over the length that I wanted to go. In the next lecture, we'll talk about the outbreak of World War II. So we'll start in 1933 Germany, and we will go all the way through 1939 when the war started and German tanks rolled into Poland. Until then, have a fantastic weekend, and I'll see you guys next week.